Let me ask you about sentencing reform. One of the cornerstones of your tenure as Attorney General has been reducing the sentences of nonviolent drug offenders. Do you see it as a civil rights issue?
Yeah, I certainly do. If one looks at the impact that the policies that we put in place, well-intentioned, but the impact of those policies over time, you have seen taken from various communities across the country, young men especially, who could have been the future of those communities and who certainly did wrong but didn't need to go to jail for as long as they did with these mandatory minimum sentences that we had. When you see the disproportionate impact on communities of color, especially when you see that drug usage among African Americans, Hispanics is roughly the same as whites, and yet you see Hispanics and African Americans going to jail for far longer at a much greater rate. Yeah, it's a civil rights issue and one that I'm determined to confront as long as I'm Attorney General.
This past spring, Yahoo News reported the president may grant clemency to thousands of federal drug offenders who are serving time right now. 18,000 have already applied for clemency. Will they be released, and if so, when?
Well, we certainly will look at the applications that have come in. We set out criteria that had to be met. They had to serve at least 10 years. They had to be shown that they could behave themselves while they were in prison, that they were not part of drug gangs or had not been engaged in violent crimes. So those people who meet those criteria will in fact get the clemency that the president has said should be theirs.
And when do you expect that to happen?
Well, we've just started to receive the applications at this point. So we're going through them now in cooperation with members of the private bar, as well as an enhanced parole office that we have at the Justice Department. So my hope is that over the next months, we'll start to see decisions being made.
More than 18 states have decriminalized marijuana. 2 states, as you know, Colorado and Washington, have outright legalized it for recreational use. Yet, at the federal level, marijuana is still classified in the same category as heroin. In your view, should that change?
Well, I think it's certainly a question that we need to ask ourselves, whether or not marijuana is as serious a drug as is heroin, especially given what we've seen recently with regard to heroin, the progression of people from using opioids to heroin use, the spread and the destruction that heroin is perpetrating all around our country. And to see how, by contrast, what the impact is of marijuana use. Now, it can be destructive if used in certain ways, but the question of whether or not they should be in the same category is something that I think we need to ask ourselves and use science as the basis for making that determination.
Given what we know now, do you think marijuana should be decriminalized at the federal level?
Well, that is something for Congress to decide. I think that we have taken...
But what's your position on it?
Well, I think that we have taken a look at the experiments that are going on in Colorado and in Washington, and we're going to see what happens there, and I think that'll help inform us as to what we want to do on the federal level.
For you, the jury is still out?
Yeah, it is.
Senator Rubio, here we are in Little Havana in Miami, where so much of the Cuban American community lives. In fact, 70% of all Cuban Americans live in Florida.
Yeah.
I didn't realize
and growing.
this. Yeah, and this is Versailles restaurant,
right,
which is an iconic Cuban restaurant. Tell us a little bit about this
Well, it's funny.
place.
The first time I told someone to meet me at Versailles, they told me they didn't like French food. And I said, well, it's not French. It's Versailles because of the mirrors. And it's kind of turned into the center of the Cuban American community's activity. When there's anything Cuba-centric, this is where they come. And the coffee counter here is always an experience. Virtually anyone who's run for president in the last 25 years has visited that coffee counter.
Tell us a little bit about what we're eating here.
This is called vaca frita, which translates literally to fried cow. But it basically,
yum.
Then you're supposed to put the black beans. You can drink it as a soup, but most people pour the black beans on the rice.
I used to live in Miami, so I remember this well, and I still love black beans and rice. And you didn't order any plantanos. What's wrong with you?
They're coming. We did that. They'll be here in a minute, I'm sure.
Do you still eat a lot of Cuban food? Because obviously you're Cuban American. Your parents came here in 1956.
Mm-hmm.
So was this a part of your childhood, and
It was.
does
Well,
it continue?
I mean, this is what we made at home. I don't eat as much of it these days because if you ate Cuban food every day, you'd weigh 300 pounds. But
Tell me a little bit about your heritage. I mean, your parents obviously grew up in Cuba. What were their lives like?
my mom was from her father was born to a farming family in Cuba, one of multiple children, large number of children. My father's history, he grew up in Havana his whole life. His mother died when he was very young, so he went to work right away. So they met, but they struggled in Cuba. They weren't politically connected, they didn't have family wealth, and they just didn't see a path for upward mobility. So they came to the U.S. in 1956 with my brother, and they struggled here too. My dad primarily as a bartender, my mom a number of different jobs as a cashier again, as a maid, and lived, working class lives and allowed us the opportunity to have a better life.
How were your parents emblematic of the American dream, you think?
It's actually an interesting question that I talk a lot about in my book, American Dreams, because my parents are part of a time in American history where virtually anyone who was willing to work hard could find a job that paid them enough to live off. Maybe you weren't rich, but a job that paid you enough to one day own a home, have a family car, maybe take, modest vacations, and ultimately send your kids to college and leave them better off than yourself. And that was my parents' experience. They had very little formal education, either one of them. But working as a bartender and a maid, my parents made it to the middle class. I mean, we owned a home in a safe and stable neighborhood, and their kids all four of their children ended up being college graduates and had lives much better than our parents. That's not just our story. That is the backbone of the American story, and it's why I wanted to write this book, American Dreams, that we have today, is that a growing number of Americans are finding that's no longer true.
Todas las noches cuando miro al cielo, brillan tus ojos como dos luceros, ojos tan puros como el agua clara que calma las heridas de mi pobre corazón.
Recently, President Obama announced normalization of diplomatic relations with Cuba after 5 decades of embargoes and closed borders. You were very outspoken about this. You totally disagree with this step. Why?
In the last decade, every nation in the Western Hemisphere has had a free and fair election, except for one, Cuba. Everyone agrees that the Cuban people deserve democracy and freedom. A democracy of their choosing. It could be a parliamentary system, it could be a republic, but freedom. The freedom to have independent political parties, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, these fundamental rights that have now globally accepted for the most part. So the debate is, what is the best way to bring that about? And there's two choices. Choice number one is trade liberalization and diplomatic recognition. And the argument that people like the president make is, the more we're engaged and involved in Cuba, the more we're going to be able to influence the direction of Cuba. And the other is, no, we hold out on trade and we hold out on diplomatic relations as leverage. If they want diplomatic relations and more trade with us, they have to create
Yeni smartphone almak fikrindəsən? MyPhone. Sərfəli qiymətlərlə Dubaydan.
Here's something most people don't know about marijuana. Officially, the U.S. federal government classifies it as a Schedule I drug. That is the strictest classification they have, period, full stop. That means the government thinks marijuana is more dangerous than Schedule II drugs like cocaine or meth. It means they think marijuana is on the same plane as heroin. About 3,000 people died from heroin overdoses in 2010. You know how many people died directly from overdosing on marijuana? 0. And I don't mean 0 in 2010, I mean 0 in basically recorded human history. Which isn't to say smoking hay bales worth of pot is a good idea. It's not. But notice what I did there. You hear that all the time. That's what we in the media business call the to be sure paragraph. It's the paragraph where we cover our asses. Almost everyone says it. Even the people who think legalizing marijuana is a great idea don't say it's a good thing. The argument for legalizing pot isn't that pot is good, but that the war on pot is bad. But there is a way in which legal pot could be a huge public health win. I mean, one of the biggest public health wins we've had in decades, saving huge numbers of lives. Let's go back to that drug schedule. There is one drug you won't see on there, even though it is a hell of a lot more dangerous than pot or even cocaine. That's alcohol. The thing about alcohol is it's really bad for you, lethally bad for you. I don't want to be a hypocrite here. I enjoy a drink. But the evidence on this, you cannot run away from it. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention say there are 88,000 deaths each year attributable to alcohol. About 25,000 of them are just direct overdoses. The numbers here are really amazing. A Columbia University study found that being drunk increases the risk of a fatal accident 13-fold. Pot, by contrast, increases the risk less than 2-fold. Then there's all the other nasty stuff alcohol leads to. It's a big contributor to violence, to crime, to addiction. It breaks up families, it gives people cancer, it gives them liver failure. People forget this, but prohibition, we laugh at it now, but it was happening for a reason. People drank more then, and it was a scourge. So this is a question with legal pot. Would people use it as a replacement or a complement to alcohol? If it's a replacement, it's a huge deal. Marijuana is a lot safer to use than alcohol. People don't die from it. They rarely kill others while on it. More marijuana and less alcohol means fewer deaths from intoxication, fewer drunk driving fatalities, less crime, less violence. But if marijuana complements alcohol rather than replacing it, then it's a problem. If it makes people, for whatever reason, drink more, then legalizing pot might actually make our alcohol problem worse. Now I'm going to say something that kind of sucks. We actually don't know the answer here. There's encouraging early evidence. In a survey of Canadian medical marijuana users, 41% said they replace alcohol with marijuana. Another survey of California medical marijuana users found they drank less than the national average. But those are medical marijuana users. They might be different than the general population. People using marijuana for fun might have a very different relationship to alcohol than people using marijuana because they're sick. But this isn't just something we can study, it's something we can affect, that we can change. Since we know a lot of people want to use some kind of mind-altering substance, we could arrange public policy to push them towards a safer one. But right now, we can't, because the federal government, against all the evidence, thinks marijuana is an incredibly, insanely dangerous substance with absolutely no redeeming value under any circumstance. What are they smoking?
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how